I had known the moment of every wolf's death since I was 7 years old. Not a vision exactly, more like a door swinging open the instant my gaze met theirs. A single image pressing itself behind my eyes with the certainty of stone. How and where, and the quality of light in that last moment. My father's death I had seen when I was 9, a cold morning, a stallion's kick, the sound of wind in the pine brakes, and I had spent 6 years watching it come true from a distance I could do nothing to close. My mother's I had seen before I understood what I was seeing. My counselors, my sentries, my wolves, every face in Veldrath was a door I could not keep closed. I had learned to hold my gaze flat, to look through people rather than at them, to rule from a dais a careful step further back than any king before me. It was not cruelty. It was the only way I knew to live inside a gift that felt, most mornings, exactly like a sentence. The pack had their own name for it. The Seer King, they called me, half in reverence, half in the particular wariness people reserve for men they cannot read. They brought their disputes to my hall, bowed their heads over my table, drank my meat at feast, and all the while kept something of themselves pulled back, the way a wolf keeps one ear cocked for a sound it cannot yet name. I did not blame them. I would have done the same. I had ruled Veldrath alone for 11 years when she came through the gate. It was early in the cold season. The winter sickness had moved through the lower hold that year, a cough that settled in the lungs and would not leave, rattling the old wolves and the young ones alike, and my head healer Dron had sent word down through the Pine Road villages that we needed hands. Herbfolk healers, anyone with knowledge of the root medicines and the steam treatments. I had approved the call without thinking much of it. It was the kind of decision a king makes without lifting his eyes from the table. I lifted my eyes that morning because the gate dogs went quiet. They always barked. Even at faces they knew they barked, two great gray animals with opinions about every arrival. When they stopped, I looked up from the window of the high study without knowing why, and I saw her come through the arch. She was not remarkable to look at, not in the way my court was accustomed to remarkable. No escort, no pack colors, a single woman on foot, carrying a basket on one arm and a worn canvas satchel on the other, her brown cloak patched at the hem and dark with the damp of the morning snow. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her boots were practical. She walked the way a person walks when they have walked a long way and know there is still work waiting at the end of it, without hurry, without performance, steadily. The gate wolves moved to stop her and she said something. I could not hear it through the glass, and the sentry checked the roster and waved her through. And then, because I was already watching, because the dogs were still silent, because something had moved in the air of the morning in a way I could not account for, she tilted her face up toward the keep's walls. Not looking for anything, I think. Just looking, the way you look at a thing you've arrived at after a long road and are glad to have reached. Her eyes came level with my window. I looked into them. And there was nothing. No door, no image, no certainty of stone pressing itself behind my eyes. I had looked into perhaps 4,000 pairs of eyes in my life and I had never once seen nothing. Absence was not nothing. Absence had its own shape, its own texture, the way a wound has a shape even after it closes. This was not absence. This was something that had no shape I owned a word for, a warmth, a stillness, a space where the knowledge should have been and instead there was her, just her, looking at the keep walls on a cold morning with snow in her hair and a basket of herbs on her arm and nothing dying anywhere I could find. My wolf, who had not stirred in years, lifted his head. I stepped back from the window and stood in the middle of my study for a long time, not moving. Then I sat down at the desk and did not do any of the work on it. Her name was Myra. I learned this because I asked Dron, which I did not usually do. Dron was a practical man with no interest in my moods, and he told me her name, her origin. A village 3 days' walk south. No pack affiliation. No alpha claim. The kind of herbalist who moves from hold to hold as the need calls her, and her intended assignment. The East Ward, where the worst of the lung-sick wolves were coughing through the night. Good hands, I asked. Dron looked at me the way he looked at things he found mildly surprising. I'll know by morning, he said, and left. By morning, he had moved her to the worst cases. I did not go to the East Ward. A king has no business in the sick rooms. That is what healers are for, and Dron was particular about his space, and I had always respected it. I found instead that I was rerouting myself through corridors I had no reason to walk, on timings that placed me adjacent to the East Ward's entrance in the way that could, if examined closely, only be called deliberate. I told myself I was checking on the recovery progress. My wolf, who was not a subtle creature, made a sound in my chest that was not quite agreement. I heard her before I saw her on the second day, her voice carrying through the open door of the corridor, low and even, speaking to one of the older wolves who had been working himself into a coughing panic. I need you to breathe out first, she said. All the way out. Don't try for the breath in yet, out first, empty yourself and then let it come. Your lungs know what to do. You just have to stop fighting them. A pause, the sound of effortful exhaling, then a long, slow inhalation, and then silence where the panicked cough had been. Good, she said, again. I stood in the corridor for longer than was defensible, listening. On the third day, I walked through the ward door. Dron was at the far end speaking to one of the junior healers. 3 of the sick wolves were sleeping, their breathing easier than it had been. Myra was at the second bed from the door, grinding something in a small stone bowl, and she looked up when I came in without the particular flinch I had come to expect from most of my pack when I appeared without announcement. She looked up, her eyes met mine. Nothing again. That same warmth, that same still blankness where the certainty should be. My wolf pressed forward in my chest, so hard I had to take a careful breath. My lord, she said, not afraid, not fawning, simply acknowledging the king in her sick room with the directness of someone who had work to finish and was prepared to be interrupted by it if she had to. How are they? I asked. Better. She set down the grinding stone and looked at the row of beds with the assessing gaze of someone who has been adding up details for days. The older wolf at the end, Bren, will need another week before he's up. The 2 in the middle should be on their feet in 3 days if they keep to the steam treatments. The pup in the corner I'm less certain about. He keeps pulling the compress off. She tilted her head at the corner bed, where a young wolf of perhaps 4 years was indeed regarding the compress on his chest with deep suspicion. He thinks it smells bad. Does it? It smells terrible, she said, but it works. The pup looked at me and then at her and then, with great reluctance, left the compress alone. Something shifted in the ward, something in the quality of the light or the air or only in my own chest, and I became aware that I had been standing in this room for longer than any stated purpose would account for. I made myself walk to the end bed where Bren was sleeping, asked Dron 2 questions I already knew the answers to, and left. My wolf did not settle for the rest of the day. That night I sat in the high study and did what I had not done in many years. I tried to think clearly about something I could not explain. The gift had never failed before, not once. Not a child, not an elder, not a wolf whose face I had seen for a single passing moment. The gift was not kind and it was not optional, and it had never in all my life presented me with nothing. And yet when I looked into Myra's eyes there was nothing, or not nothing, something. Something I had no instrument for. I pulled out the old books that had been in the study since my grandfather's time, the ones the elder Hesta had told me contained the lore of the Seer Kings. There had been 3 in Veldrath's history, she had said, men born with the death sight, and the records of their lines were kept in those volumes because someone once had thought the knowledge worth preserving. I had read them when the gift first came on me, at 7, and understood perhaps a third of the old script. I was older now. I read for most of the night. There was not much. The Seer Kings were recorded mostly in the dry language of administrative chronicle, their rulings, their military decisions, the names of their heirs. but in the margins of the second volume, in a different hand, smaller and more careful, someone had written something. I had to angle the lamp to read it. The seer cannot see his own death. This is the moon's protection for the one who must carry the gift. And it is written that the seer cannot see the death of the one the moon has chosen for him, the fated Luna, because she is not appointed to die away from him. They are bound forward. She will not leave him behind. I read it twice. Then I closed the book and sat in the dark for a long time. My wolf was entirely still. The way a wolf is still when it knows something the man does not yet have words for and is waiting. I did not sleep that night. But it was not the restless sleeplessness of grief or worry. It was the sleeplessness of a man who has been given a piece of information so large he needs to find somewhere to put it, and is turning it over in his hands slowly, learning its edges. The fourth day. The raiders came in the mid-morning. They were not the organized kind, not a war band from the eastern holds or the northern tribes who ran formal challenges. They were the desperate kind, a ragged group who had been living in the pine forest since the early cold had cut off their supply roads, and desperation makes men do things they would not otherwise attempt. 3 of them got over the east wall before the sentries caught the first alarm, scrambling and reckless, armed with short blades, and the urgency of men who had not eaten properly in a week. My sentries moved fast. I was in the yard already. I had been walking the grounds, which I told myself was an inspection, and which my wolf told me was something else entirely, and I had my sword in my hand before the first alarm bell had finished its first ring. It was over in minutes. 2 raiders yielded. 1 did not, and one of my sentries took a cut on the arm that would need stitching. We moved to secure the yard, and I was issuing orders, my attention on the 2 captured men and the gap in the east wall that needed examining immediately, when a sound from behind me cut through all of it. Not a shout, a small sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone who has seen something coming and made a decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. I turned. There had been a 4th raider I had not accounted for, one who had come in over a different point of the wall and gotten lost in the confusion, disoriented, stumbling through the east yard with a blade in his hand and no idea where he was going. The east door to the sick ward was open. Myra had come through it with a bundle of fresh compressed cloths in her arms. She had heard the alarm and was moving to close the door, to get the sick wolves back away from any danger. And the raider, spinning wild and frightened in the yard, had thrown the blade without aim, the way frightened men throw things, at the shape nearest him. The shape nearest him was a young wolf, one of my sentry's pups, Dron's apprentice, a boy of perhaps 15 who had come into the yard to help and should not have been there, who was standing directly in the blade's path and was not moving because he was frozen. Myra was between them in 1 step. The blade caught her across the outer arm, not deep, a long graze more than a wound, but enough, and she took the impact without going down, stepping deliberately into it the way you step into a blow to kill its force, shielding the boy behind her with her own body. My sentry had the raider on the ground half a second later. It was done. The yard was still. But I was already moving. I crossed the yard in 4 strides and caught her arm as she turned. She was looking at the boy, checking whether he was all right, her expression not frightened but focused, the expression of someone assessing damage. I caught her arm, the injured arm, gently, and she let me turn it to look at the cut, and her eyes came up to mine. I looked into them, and my mark burned to life. It was not like anything I could have described before it happened. Not a pain exactly, more like a fire that had been banked for 30 years suddenly given air, a heat that moved from my wrist up through my arm and into my chest and did not stop there. I heard my wolf before I knew I was making a sound, a howl, raw and full, the first in all my memory, and I felt the mark on my wrist flaring through the fabric of my sleeve. Myra looked down at it. Then she looked at her own wrist, where an identical mark had surfaced on her skin, luminous and silver gold in the cold light of the yard. She looked at me. Her eyes were very steady. She had just been cut across the arm and had possibly just understood something enormous about her own life, and she was steady. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I didn't know what I was." "Neither did I," said. "Not entirely, not until I looked into your eyes and saw." "Saw what?" "Nothing," I said. "I saw nothing, and I have never in my life seen nothing. That is what I've been trying to understand for 4 days." Hesta the elder had crossed the yard without my noticing. She was old, and she moved the way old wolves who have lived through a great many things move, with a calm that suggests they have been expecting the current development since before you were born. She had a book in her hands. The second volume, the one from the high study. She had taken it from the shelf sometime in the past 4 days, which meant she had been thinking about this too, in her own silence. She opened it to the margin and read aloud, to the whole yard in her carrying voice, so that everyone who had gathered to witness the aftermath of the raid could hear every word. "The seer cannot see his own death. This is the moon's protection for the one who must carry the gift, and it is written that the seer cannot see the death of the one the moon has chosen for him, the fated Luna, because she is not appointed to die away from him. They are bound forward. She will not leave him behind." She closed the book. The yard was very quiet. My wolf was quiet too, not the restless, searching quiet of the past 4 days, but the quiet of a creature that has come home after a long time away and sat down by its own fire. I looked at Myra. She was still holding the compressed cloths in her uninjured arm. Her cloak was brown and patched at the hem. The mark on her wrist was still glowing, soft and steady, a warmth that matched the warmth I had felt in my chest since the first moment I had seen nothing in her eyes and understood, without knowing the language for it yet, that something had changed. I took my cloak from my own shoulders. It was heavy, the Veldrath King's winter cloak, dark fur, and the deep gray wool that my wolves knew from a distance as the mark of the throne, the garment that signaled an alpha's claim in the old tradition. I set it around her shoulders carefully over the injured arm, making sure it did not press on the wound. Her eyes came up to mine again. "You don't have to," she said. "I don't know your ways entirely. I'm not from Veldrath. I'm not from any pack." "No," I said. "You're not from a pack." I settled the cloak evenly and looked out at the yard, at my wolves, my sentries, Hesta with her book, Drawn, who had appeared at the east ward door and was looking at the mark on Myra's wrist with the expression of a man working something out, at the sentry pup she had shielded, who was standing very still and looking at her with the particular expression of someone who has just understood what someone did for them and does not yet have the feelings organized. "You're from Veldrath. You came through the gate 4 days ago, and you have been from Veldrath since the moment you walked through it." I simply did not have the language for it yet. He was not a dramatic man, the sentry pup. He was 15 and practical, the way Drawn's apprentices tended to be practical. But he went to one knee. I don't know whether he knew the old form or had simply felt something that required a gesture that large. He went to one knee in the cold yard. The wolves followed. Not all at once. It moved through the yard like something spreading, like warmth spreading in cold water, the sentries and the elder wolves and the junior healers and the gate pack, one by one and then in clusters, finding their knees in the gray morning light. Hesta did not kneel. She was too old for her knees on cold stone, and besides she was Hesta, and she expressed herself differently. She inclined her head deeply, which from her was worth more than any knee. Myra stood in my cloak in the middle of all of it. She was looking at the sentry pup who had knelt first, her expression soft, and I understood that she was not thinking about the wolves kneeling or the mark on her wrist or what any of it meant for her life. She was thinking about a 15-year-old boy who was fine because she had moved in time, and that was enough for her. That was the whole thing. I had looked into 4,000 pairs of eyes and seen how every wolf would end. I had carried that weight alone for 30 years. I had ruled from behind a careful distance, because what else do you do when every face is a door to something you cannot unsee? I had thought more than once in the long cold years that the gift had made me something other than a man, something functional, something useful to the pack, but hollowed of the ordinary things that other wolves took for granted. Connection, warmth, the uncomplicated pleasure of meeting someone's gaze without knowing too much. She had come through my gate in the snow with a basket of herbs and a patched cloak, and she had not flinched from me. Not once. Not when I came to the ward without warning. Not when I stood in the corridor listening to her calm, a frightened wolf. Not when the mark burned to life on both our wrists, and I looked at her with everything I had been carrying for 30 years plain in my face, because there was no longer any point in carrying it hidden. She had looked back at me, and her eyes had been steady. I reached for her hand, the uninjured one, and she gave it without hesitation. There is a particular kind of man who makes speeches. I have never been that man. The pack that had bowed its head in the cold yard did not need a speech. The elder had read the text aloud, and the mark was on our wrists, and the cloak was on her shoulders. These things said what needed saying in the language Veldrath knew. I said one thing, only to her, quietly enough that it was not a proclamation. I have seen the death of everyone I have ever looked at, I said. Every wolf, every child, every elder. I have known since I was 7 years old how every person I love will leave me. And I looked into your eyes and I saw you, only you, nothing ending, nothing leaving. I turned her hand carefully in mine, looking at the mark. I did not know until 4 days ago that there was a word for that, but I think I have been waiting for it since before I understood that waiting was what I was doing. Myra looked at the mark on her wrist for a moment, then she looked up. The pup at the end of the ward, she said, is still pulling his compress off. I looked at her. He needs to stop, she said. The treatment isn't finished. After a moment I said, I'll speak to him. Good, she said, and then simply without ceremony, I'll stay then. If you want me to stay. I want you to stay. The yard was still around us, the wolves holding their quiet, the cold morning light coming down through the pine line and falling across the black stone of the keep walls. Myra stood in my cloak with the mark warm on her wrist and the herbs from the compress still faintly in the air around her, and she looked at the ward door with the expression of someone who has things to finish and is glad to have a place to finish them. Hesta caught my eye from across the yard and permitted herself, just barely, the look of a woman who has been right about something for a very long time and is not going to say so. I had ruled Veldrath alone for 11 years. I had looked into the eyes of everyone who had ever stood in this yard and known too much always, and carried it by myself because there was no other option. The gift had given me the shape of every ending, every winter, every loss. Every morning I woke up knowing what was coming, and I had thought for a long time that this was simply what I was. A man who knew, a king who carried it alone. What I had not understood, until a brown-cloaked woman walked through my gate in the early snow and tilted her face up to the keep walls, was that the knowing and the carrying were two different things. The gift remained. It would always remain. I would still look into the eyes of my pack and see what I had always seen, the shape of time, the certainty of loss, the door swinging open whether I willed it or not. But I would no longer see it in hers. Every morning for the rest of my life, I would look into Myra's eyes and see nothing. Not the nothing of emptiness, the nothing of always, the nothing of a woman who was not appointed to leave, who was bound forward with me in the old language of the moon, who had stepped in front of a thrown blade for a frightened boy without a second's hesitation, and then in the same breath asked about a pup's compress. The nothing of someone who was simply there. I had waited 30 years to see nothing so clearly.